So, hi everyone, and welcome to our panel on housing across the HDP nexus, protection, rights, and recovery. This panel is part of the Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week and is co-convened by the new Shelter, Land and Site Coordination Cluster, the Norwegian Refugee Council, Habitat for Humanity Great Britain, and the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global. My name is Kerry Holloway, and I'm a research fellow with the Humanitarian Policy Group, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's session will explore the protection of housing rights in crises and reconstruction. We hope that our discussion today will simulate sector-wide discussion on best practices and new approaches that integrate humanitarian and development phases under a rights-based lens and that engage development and humanitarian actors alike. Our session today will begin with some opening remarks from Jim Robinson, the HLP focal point for the Shelter, Land and Site Coordination Cluster, followed by a panel of three speakers, a brief audience Q&A, and concluding remarks from two donor representatives. If you do have any questions during the session, please put it in the designated Q&A box on Zoom. You're also welcome to introduce yourself to the other participants in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jim Robinson for our opening remarks. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Kerry. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you for joining us. And if you're watching the recording, good to see you as well. So my name's Jim Robinson. I was the coordinator of the Housing, Land and Property Area of Responsibility within the Global Protection Cluster. So you may well know that under the humanitarian reset, the areas of responsibility have been consolidated into this single protection cluster, with the exception of Housing, Land and Property, or HLP. That is now part of the newly established Shelter, Land and Site Coordination Cluster, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. But I wanted to begin with a few comments just to frame today's discussion. When people are facing crisis, they're confronted with an urgent and deeply human question. Where can we live safely? Can we stay here? What does the future hold? Housing, Land and Property Rights, HLP, they sit at the centre of that question. They're not a technical afterthought. They're a golden thread that runs from emergency shelter response through to resilience, recovery, durable solutions, right across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. For people who are forced to flee their homes, this question is immediate and it is existential. Many do not know where they'll sleep next week, next month, whether they'll ever to be able to return home. And when displaced families lack documentation for this temporary accommodation, whether it's collective centres, informal settlements, they're going to live in uncertainty, constantly fearing eviction, arbitrary rent increases, or further displacement. They cannot make plans, they can't invest in their surroundings. It's a struggle to live in dignity. And even then, when the conflict ends or a disaster subsides, the challenges do not. Homes may be damaged, destroyed, or occupied. Land may be contested. Documents may have been lost, and without evidence or proof of tenure, people can be excluded from repair and reconstruction support, compensation schemes, financial assistance, or other areas of support. Access to land for shelter is essential for survival during displacement. It's also pivotal to self-reliance and solutions. Housing and HLP matter in every type of crisis, whether it's conflict, disaster, climate-related shocks, complex overlapping emergencies, and across all different types of legal and governance contexts. In climate-related disasters, for example, these often destroy not only homes, but also land and property documentation. Without proof of tenure, people are left vulnerable to evictions, unable to access recovery assistance. And supporting the restoration or replacement of documentation is therefore not just an administrative exercise, it is protective. It secures rights and it enables recovery. At the same time, we must recognise that many people affected by all sorts of crises never had formal legal registration or title documents, yet they legitimately possess and use their land and housing. So a rights-based approach requires that we address these realities, not ignore them. And we also know that climate impacts can be cyclical. This challenges us to think beyond response and towards preparedness. Can we strengthen clarity around tenure before disaster strikes? Can we better document and secure people's relationships to housing and land so that recovery is faster and more equitable when displacement occurs? In some cases like South Sudan and Mozambique, for example, people face both disasters such as repeated flooding, cyclones, as well as ongoing shifting dynamic violent conflict. And we must also acknowledge difficult realities. Disasters can be used as opportunities to permanently displace populations, as can conflict. They can be used as opportunities to redraw demographics, expose insecure tenure arrangements. And under the banner of recovery, we've seen unjust exclusion zones or bypassing of established rights, with the most vulnerable facing the greatest risks and unable to access the support that is theirs. Ignoring HLP issues is not neutral. It causes harm and it is costly. And when housing interventions are implemented without attention to land rights, shelters may be built on contested land, for example. Families might be evicted from structures that were intended to protect them. Infrastructure investments can be lost due to forced evictions, protection risks increase, funding is wasted. For instance, in Somalia, it's documented that over 4.6 million US dollars investment in infrastructure, like wash infrastructure, community centres, schools, solar streetlights, was lost in a single year around Mogadishu due to forced evictions. And these were mainly attributed to insecure land tenure. So when we approach housing in crisis through a rights-based lens, centred on adequate housing, we ask better questions. Who has the right to live here? Under what conditions? For how long? Who is excluded? Who is at risk? And this approach can prioritise meaningful community participation. It addresses power imbalances, it promotes tenure security, and it strengthens social cohesion and has the potential for peace building. We know housing is not simply a structure, it is an enabler. Secure housing supports protection outcomes, women's rights, education, livelihoods and health, including restitution. Rights-based housing intervention also reinforce a wide range of fundamental rights. The right to life, security, water, sanitation, food, work, and the protection of the child and family. So what can we do as a crisis unfolds, as people are on the move? Well, every context is unique. There's no copy and paste model, but there are principles that apply across diverse crises. We'll hear about some of these today. And this is also where coordination becomes essential. By coordinating around where people live, rather than around institutional mandates, we can identify risks early, we can reduce duplication and gaps, and connect immediate shelter support with longer-term recovery pathways. The newly established Shelter, Land and Site Coordination Cluster provides an opportunity to work in a more integrated way. It brings together shelter and household items, site coordination and planning, and HLP expertise, recognizing that these issues are inseparable in practice. So after floods, earthquakes, conflict, people on the move might end up in schools, informal settlements, host communities, or temporary sites. Providing that shelter is essential, but it's only the first step. And a shelter cannot be simply placed anywhere. People need to know whether they're allowed to build or rebuild, whether land is safe from future hazards, whether they risk eviction. Settlements must be organised so that water, sanitation, health, education, protection services function effectively. And without this site coordination, services overlap in some areas where others are left without support. Tensions between displaced and host communities can rise. And too often, shelter is treated as short-term humanitarian assistance. When we see housing as only temporary, we miss its transformative potential. People can remain stuck in cycles of uncertainty and dependency. But when people have a secure place to live, then stability can follow. Investment in livelihoods can take place and recovery accelerates. People may settle in this place or they may look to return. Land and property issues are often the hidden barrier to that recovery. Documents may have been lost in the disaster or conflict. Some families may have lived on land informally. Others may face inheritance disputes or eviction risks. And if we don't address them early, return and reconstruction can stall. Shelters can be dismantled and families can be displaced again. This is why shelter assistance, site coordination, and HLP support must work together. By centering this response on the question of where people live and whether they can remain there safely and with dignity, we strengthen protection, we reduce risk, and we create a pathway from emergency response to more durable solutions. Ultimately, we return to that fundamental question: where can people live safely and can they stay there? And what does the future hold? Our responsibility is to ensure that the answer is grounded in rights, dignity, and on a pathway that considers solutions from the start as we head towards long-term recovery. It's a pleasure to be here and I look forward to the discussions. Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks, Jim, for that comprehensive overview of the new cluster and insights into how we should be thinking about HLP. So we'll now turn to our three panelists. First, we have Skylar Kokoschot, the Information Counselling and Legal Assistance Specialist for the Norwegian Refugee. Second on our panel is Leilani Farah, the Global Director of the Shift and former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing. And finally, Victoria Moskulix, the Housing Recovery and Partnership Lead for Habitat Humanity Ukraine. So Skylar, we'll start with you. Jim's just mentioned that we need to start thinking about HLP from the start of a crisis rather than waiting for the emergency phase to end. So can you explain in more depth why this is the case and what that would look like in a situation like Gaza?
Yeah, the why this is the case is quite simple. In fact, if you wait to incorporate the protection of HLP rights until after the emergency phase of the interventions, then you've already violated them. And that is undermining the sustainability of all emergency interventions and then future interventions that the emergency may be the basis of. So in Gaza, this incorporation has looked or been mainly focused on due diligence, drafting of lease or temporary use agreements, and CDR ADR programming. So due diligence or verification of tenure rights has been key to supporting site management actors when they're either setting up new sites or beginning operations in informal sites. Given the limited space available in Gaza, site residents are often faced with threats of eviction or exploitation. Thus, through negotiated lease or temporary use agreements, legal actors have been able to mitigate site residents' exposure to protection risks and at the same time still protect the rights of the landowners. Simultaneously, due diligence through community-led verification processes has facilitated light touch shelter interventions such as minor rehabilitations or installations of sealing off kits, better enabling participants to have some form of adequate shelter in the emergency, but still not violating the HLP rights, even though formal land registries have been destroyed and the majority of tenure documentation has been lost. So through these community-led verification, we've been able to support a rights-based approach to emergency shelter interventions. Finally, the multiple rounds of displacement across Gaza has fueled tensions over remaining HLP assets, such as open or agricultural land or partially destroyed buildings. Through conflict and dispute resolution, or ADR, whichever you go with naming wise, HLP actors have been able to mitigate the risk of physical violence, as well as potentially the risk of recurrent cycles of violence.
Great, thanks, Skylar. Leilani, as a human rights lawyer, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear Skylar referring to the need to protect people's rights. What do you think is the value add of a rights-based approach when it comes to housing, land, and property? And what role should human rights play in emergencies when it comes to HLP?
Thanks, and thanks for inviting me into the conversation. I'm having some internet instability, so hopefully it'll be okay. Um, I just want to make a note before I make my comments about the value of the right to housing. Um, I just want to make a comment about the term domicide, and just to say that I I maybe am an outlier on this, but I'm actually not that keen on the term. And part of it is related to what home and housing means and how we move away from that if you use that term domicide. But part of it is also I'm really so very concerned about the status of international law right now, obviously, because it's being violated with impunity by states around the world. And so I just want us to be careful about introducing new legal concepts at a time when our existing legal concepts aren't even being implemented. And I do think the right to housing has everything we need to get at that notion of domicile. So I just wanted to put that out there. The other thing I want to say is I completely agree with the comments that Skylar and Jim made about the way rights lay this foundation. The right to housing can lay this foundation. So if you're waiting until, you know, after the emergency has happened, as Skylar said, you've waited for the violation to happen. And so that would be wrong. But I would say also in times outside of conflict, outside of a natural disaster or a climate related disaster, you want to lay the foundation of the right to housing to create the most resilient communities that you can and people with entitlements to land and property. And so it's important at all times to implement the right to housing. I'll say this, that the right to housing is has been universally agreed upon by states around the world. Whether they're implementing it is another question, of course, but that's one of the values. It is a universally recognized human right, and we have to keep articulating that. It was in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration, and it's been in every treaty since, and states have ratified those treaties. So that is one of its strengths. The other things I will say about the value of a right to housing approach is it's one of the most well articulated social and economic rights. We have all of the standards articulated. They exist. It's not like some airy fairy, oh, everyone has the right to housing. Jim talked a lot about security of tenure. That's a cornerstone of the right to housing. There's real meaning there. There are other standards as well. Affordability, access to services, sustainability, etc. So those standards can be harnessed. Um, there's also a standard of reasonableness, which I really love that a lot of people don't talk about, but it is it's such an easy thing to apply. Is this policy reasonable in any context? And I think often what we're being told is reasonable could be denounced as unreasonable. And I'm sorry about the sun. I will just close this. Oh, so sad to get rid of the sun, but a little bit blinding. The other three things I'll say is the right to housing imposes a certain process. So it's not just about the standards, it requires the meaningful engagement of the affected community. So if we look at what's happening in Gaza right now, I mean, one of the major atrocities is beyond the major atrocity of genocide is the lack of engagement of Palestinians in Gaza who have survived this awful thing in their own future. And that under the right to housing is just simply unacceptable, especially in light of Palestinians being indigenous. Then the whole right to self-determination kicks in. Nothing can happen without their free, prior, and informed consent, etc. So those are human rights values. The right to housing also requires that resources be spent in a certain way. So it's not just higgledy-piggledy, we'll throw a little bit of money this way. The maximum available resources have to be harnessed to ensure people have adequate housing because as Jim and Schuyler said, it's so essential to human dignity and to life itself. And the other area that is so important about human rights generally, although we can all exercise some skepticism around this, is accountability. Human rights are meant to be an accountability mechanism. Okay, so the accountability mechanisms are really weak. We've seen that. Some might argue, including myself, that the system was established that way. So obviously we need reform. However, states have signed and ratified treaties. That's got to mean something. Those are legal commitments, and we at least can use that as a bit of a stick. I don't know. I feel like I'm trying to convince myself. But certainly super important, that notion of accountability. And again, I'll just reiterate that there's something essential about laying as a foundation the human right to housing in light of its tentacles to every other right, especially its tentacles to the right to life. And so we must think about it in times of peace, in times of conflict, in times of pre-disaster, potential disaster, etc., because that will make us more resilient. And sorry, the last thing I'll say, human rights are never suspended. They're not suspended in times of war. They're not suspended ever, and they run alongside the laws of war. And so we have to start figuring out ways, and that's what's so beautiful about this session, of integrating humanitarian law, the laws of war, and human rights law in a more holistic way. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Leilani. You've given us quite a lot to go on for the rest of this panel. Victoria, I'll come to you next. So how do you see the role of human rights playing out when it comes to housing, land, and property questions in Ukraine?
Thanks a lot for this question. So basically, when we speak about housing, land, and the property in Ukraine, we must recognize that the housing is already a global challenge, and across the world, access to adequate and affordable housing remains difficult, and Ukraine is not exception and was not before the full-scale invasion. However, since February 2022, the scale and the urgency of the problem have dramatically increased. And according to the latest rapid damage and needs assessment conducted by the World Bank together with the government of Ukraine and international partners, approximately 14% of Ukraine's housing stock has been damaged or destroyed, affecting more than 3 million households. And as for 2025, around 5 million people are internally displaced in Ukraine, and approximately 5 million Ukrainians are recorded as refugees abroad. And in this situation, human rights in housing are not theoretical, they are very practical, and they mean fair access to housing, protection of the property rights, special attention to vulnerable groups, and transparent decision making. And Habitat for Humanity works as an organization exclusively in the housing, shelter, and settlement sector. And we believe that every person deserves a decent place to live. For us, housing is not only about walls and roofs, it is about resilience, inclusion, and long-term stability. And this is why our work in Ukraine is also very much focused on the policy and advocacy. And we are closely collaborating now with the Ministry of the Development, whose mandate includes recovery and housing reform. And two of our colleagues are officially seconded to support the drafting of the new laws and structural reforms. One of the most important steps in this process is development of the new bills, and basically the bill on the basic principle of housing policy. It is a new law which replaces outdated 1983 Soviet-era housing code and creates a foundation for the modern rights-based housing system. And this reform includes social housing, new financial instruments such as mortgages, leasing and rent-to-own mechanism, digitalization of the processes, and importantly, prioritization of vulnerable groups and their specific needs. So it also redefines public housing as a long-term social asset rather than something that might be rapidly privatized. At the same time, we see as the only work on the legislation, it is not enough. This is why we are implementing a social housing pilot in Kalush, this is Ivano-Frankivsk region. So we secured 10-year municipal land lease and refurbished 3 buildings of the abandoned kindergarten, transforming it into 47 apartments. And this is the project which is going to be then managed by Ukrainian NGO, acting as the first social housing operator. And this actually demonstrates how policy reform and practical implementation must go hand in hand. And to further develop this approach, we also launched an empty space assessment in the cooperation with the Ministry of the Development in the 3 pilot oblasts, Kyiv, Poltava, and Ivano-Frankivsk. And the goal is to identify vacant and underutilized properties and can be converted into social housing, making the better use of the existing assets. So basically, we as an organization in Ukraine, we are working on the different level, trying to combine the best practices together.
Great, thanks, Victoria. And actually, if I can just stay with you for the next question, how do you think you can successfully bridge that gap between humanitarian and development? You've talked a bit about how you've been working with the government, how you've been working on new policies, but how do you bridge that gap so that housing and other important infrastructure aren't just left to the end of a crisis?
Well, actually, bringing the gap between humanitarian and development work is always challenging. In the series, there are like different phases, first emergency response and then long-term development later. But in Ukraine, these phases are happening simultaneously. Humanitarian needs are still present, but the scale is different, of course, compared to 2022. But vulnerable people still need the support. From our experience, Ukraine is the only country where Habitat for Humanity operates during the full-scale war. This reality forces us to rethink traditional sequences between humanitarian and development work. We cannot afford till the crisis is going to come to the end before we start thinking long term. And as a housing focused organization, we believe that housing and infrastructure cannot be postponed until the post crisis phase. In many contexts, crises last for years, and this is also the situation in Ukraine. Therefore, even emergency interventions must contribute to long-term resilience. And in our case, our energy efficiency work is a clear example of that. So this is one of our main pillars, and we started our working in this topic in Ukraine even before the full-scale invasion, and we see how now this challenge is living this second life because before full-scale war, it was more about reducing the energy consumption, and now when people are sitting in their houses without proper heating for weeks and outside is up -20, we see the need of such kind of the interventions, and also we understand how we need also think ahead, how these needs might occur in the different situations. And our team this year, we were exploring different ways how we can combine energy efficiency interventions with circular construction practices. And we have a few concepts developed for that. So one of them, it is transferring knowledge from Netherlands to Ukraine and basically establishing the new production line for prefabricated bio-based insulation panels. While the technology is not new itself, but it is not implemented in Ukraine at scale. And another concept explores producing insulation materials from the demolition waste of completely destroyed buildings. And this approach aims to reduce CO2 emissions while reusing materials locally and turning the destruction into the resource for recovery. This is how we are bridging humanitarian and development gap very practically by responding to immediate needs while designing solutions to reduce future risks. And we also understand as a civil society in Ukraine, our role is not only to react on the crisis, but also think a bit ahead and help build systems that are more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Skylar, I'm going to go back to you. So Gaza is another place where people have started to think about what reconstruction will look like. And by people, you can interpret that however you wish. How do we bridge this humanitarian and development gap in that context?
No comment on the interpretation of people. But in fact, humanitarian HLP interventions and development interventions complement each other really well, probably by default or by design. And I agree with Victoria. What we're looking at right now in Gaza is exactly the fact that we can't wait until the end of the conflict to start thinking longer term. So, from the humanitarian side, HLP interventions facilitate a rights-based foundation for shelter site management and WASH interventions through due diligence, which mitigates the risk of interventions causing further HLP violations or causing conflicts linked to HLP, or even increasing participants' exposure to protection violations, as I mentioned before. This due diligence is enhancing the sustainability of humanitarian interventions, which are then more easily transitioned into stable rights-based housing and agricultural land rehabilitation through the support of development actors. At the same time, humanitarian HLP assistance can support individuals in documenting HLP rights violations for future restitution processes in the longer term. Restitution processes are not within the humanitarian mandate necessarily, especially in the emergency phase, but that documentation has to be collected during the emergency phase before the realities of the violations disappear. And then finally, while development actors generally focus on critical services such as system strengthening, capacity strengthening of formal institutions, and longer term rule of law outcomes, humanitarian HLP legal assistance ensures that affected populations have access to those systems and are able to utilize the enhanced systems to claim and preserve their rights. humanitarian legal actors can also be a key partner in supporting development actor system strengthening efforts through the provision of evidence of practical barriers faced by affected populations and the provision of technical trainings for institutions based on those types of practical experiences.
Great, thanks, Skylar. And finally, Leilani, we'll come back to you. So I know you've also been following the situation in Gaza quite closely. What lessons do you think that we can learn from previous reconstruction efforts when it comes to what needs to happen in Gaza now?
There's so much to worry about with respect to Gaza, obviously. Um, Obviously, I'm happy to name the people that are involved that is hugely problematic. Obviously, this peace board that has been established is full of and honestly do some research, like look up these guys, and you'll see that some of them are some of the most predatory real estate actors out there. And I'm not, you know, Witkoff himself, for example, has been centrally involved. Kushner, um, let alone, Tony Blair and his own past, not with respect to real estate. So obviously deeply worrying. And the worry is a kind of disaster capitalism, kind of on steroids in a way. And we've seen this, and Jim referenced it in his comments at the top. We've seen this in many other places, and I can reflect on Puerto Rico, for example, just because I visited recently and, um, well, fairly recently. It's not when we think about disaster capitalism, we think of, corporations, multinationals moving in and extracting resources and exploiting the lands in this place. Um, there's that. And that's a real risk here, obviously, because Gaza is waterfront and has natural resources and natural gas. So that's obviously of huge interest. But it's much deeper than that. And this is what we've seen in Puerto Rico. It's a legislative framework that gets established as well to bring in multinational capital. And so what happens is a whole legislative regime gets put in place, tax laws, laws to bring capital in that make it really beneficial to the investor. And and if you look at the history of Puerto Rico since the big hurricane, you'll see there have been a series of different acts that allow investors to invest and they don't pay any income tax and et cetera, et cetera. Very, very friendly. The result is obviously a kind of colonization, an absolute extractive nature. But if you just look at everyday life, it has a very awful impact. So you see rents and housing costs escalating. You'll see local populations living in greater poverty. In Puerto Rico now, the poverty rate is up at 40%, even higher in certain categories of groups of people. I've met with communities that have been basically displaced by Airbnb. So investors investing in properties, converting entire communities. I met an older woman who was like the last woman standing in her community. Every other property practically was an Airbnb. They went in Puerto Rico, they went from a few years ago having 1,000 Airbnb units to 25,000. So you can imagine how that decimates a local population. And it means people are being displaced and then they're further away from work, so they're losing their jobs, or they don't have transportation back and forth across the island, etc. And so I think that's an obvious and real concern. We saw the grotesque, misogynistic, and colonial video that President Trump put out before he formed the peace board, indicating what he thought Gaza could look like. And then since then, the Peace Board has come up with Jared Kushner's plan for skyscrapers, absolutely not culturally relevant, no recognition of the refugee camps that are absolutely important for the right of return, and that are historical claims, all of that is just wiped out. So the concerns in Gaza are very real, and quite stark and quite particular, especially because of the 7, or is it 8, refugee camps that have to be by law reestablished. Those are land claims, and very important land claims for Palestinian statehood.
Great. Thanks, Leilani. So we're now at the end of the kind of more structured panel session, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. You might actually have to push the more button if it doesn't show up, and then you should be able to click on it. I do have a few questions that have come in that I will, I've got two, so I'll ask them both, and then we can go back through the panel. And then while the panelists are answering these, hopefully we'll get some more from the audience as well. So the two that I've got, the first one is, what could government donors do differently to incentivize more collaboration between humanitarian and development organizations in recovery context? And I do know that we have two donor representatives who will be speaking at the very end, but neither are government donors. So I guess this is a bit more specific to government donors. And then the second question is, how can humanitarian and development actors navigate their engagement with local and national authorities to ensure sustainability in their recovery efforts? So one about government donors and how can they incentivize collaboration between humanitarian and development actors. And the second one about how humanitarian and development actors can collaborate with local and national authorities. So I'm going to go back through the panel the way that you spoke originally. So Skylar, Leilani, and Victoria, if you'd like to answer either of those questions, or if you would like to respond to anything that the other panelists have just said, you're more than welcome to. And then while the panel is speaking again, if you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, please do drop it in the Q&A box. Or if you can't find that, just pop it straight in the chat. So Skylar, over to you.
Yeah, particularly on the first question, coordination mechanisms are existing within the humanitarian space. They're also existing in the development space. It is rare that I've seen a context in my work history where those two spaces speak to each other effectively. Yes, the topics of conversation within each space is different, but we all need to have a space to come together to ensure these things are aligning. I really like the new cluster, I'm going to get it wrong and Jim will kill me, SLSC cluster idea, that at least you're bringing together the site management, the shelter, and the HLP actors for humanitarian. Now we need the development actors to also be in those meetings saying, this is what we're looking at on the system strengthening side, and your emergency and humanitarian assistance can feed into it here. Let's collaborate. And I think more push from governments and donors for us to do that would always be helpful, instead of pushing for alternative forms as we see in many contexts.
Great. Thanks, Skylar. Leilani, I think you're next.
Thanks. I mean, I work outside all of these parameters, and so I'm a little less well placed to answer these questions, but I think there's an advantage of being on the outside. So when I first started working with NRC a few years back, back in 21, I was shocked actually at these kind of divisions between humanitarian and development. And I definitely agree with what Skylar said. Like, there's got to be a more integrated approach, because surely what's happening at the humanitarian end of things should be leading toward the development end of things. So there should be some synergies and a kind of it's like any work I've done on humanitarian related things has really been in the context of Palestine. And I mean, you can't just keep throwing humanitarian dollars and constantly be saying, well, we're answering the humanitarian need, because you can't build statehood, which is what all donors are interested in. All donors want to see Palestinian state remain. All donors are committed most donors are committed to a two-state solution. And so you can't have a two-state solution if you don't do what's necessary to build statehood. And so you can't just keep Palestine in this humanitarian assistance place. You have to bring in development and figure out how those two things are going to merge. And I'll just leave it there.
Thanks. And Victoria?
Yeah, I just think that it is very interesting questions, and it is very interesting to see how the same, like problems occur in a different context. And I can say from the Ukrainian side, so no one was prepared to that, and we don't have such kind of the experience and strong civil society in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. And now there are a lot of different actors, and they have their own view how that should be working on. And from our perspective, I think that our government is trying their best to, like to survive in such of the situation and find, cover the humanitarian needs and start the development right away. And I think that these different topics, they are very much inter each other, and it is good that donors are supporting also in the civil society and the state, and they are building the different programs from the different sides, so we can together both, try to reach to the situation when it is already done and we don't have a needs, but we also understand that needs are going to be in place for a really long time. So this planning, this planning, long-term view on that, if it is working right now, it is great, but still we need to develop that. It is good that we have such a conversations, and we are working together with the ministries and trying to find together the ways out of the situation.
Great, thanks, Victoria. And you touched a bit on how humanitarian development, but maybe more civil society actors can work with the government. But in the context of Gaza, I think, Leilani, it was you who was talking earlier about how people need to be involved in some of these decisions about reconstruction. And thinking about it, I mean, it is quite different from Ukraine in a lot of ways. You don't have that strong government taking the lead. And you do have a lot more maybe international humanitarian actors in the mix. How can those actors then engage with local communities and local authorities as they exist in a way that is can push back maybe against some of those more stronger voices and stronger personalities who might have different interest? And then Skylar, I'll come to you in case you want to respond as well to anything Leilani says or to that question. So Leilani, you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my experience, humanitarian organizations have a ton of experience bringing community together and getting community to identify their needs and how they envision their own future. And so it's just doing what humanitarian organizations, certainly in the context of Palestine, are already doing. I mean, I was meeting with the West Bank Consortium group that was, in fact, led by NRC. And I mean, they were meeting with community, getting community to draw up urban plans and village plans themselves, not being directorial. Now you're dealing with an exceptionally traumatized population in exceptional need. And I recognize that. So of course it's difficult and different. But it would be super important for humanitarian organizations to be able to identify, you know, to be able to identify and bring together people from the 8 refugee camps, for example. I mean, they absolutely need to be talking about what they see their future as. Do they want to go back to the sites where their refugee camps were? Do they want to name them again based on their original villages, which is how they were named? There are really important aspects here that have to be somehow discussed amidst this incredible crisis and genocide. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it is absolutely essential. And I think humanitarians already have that skill set from what I have seen and understood. They often know the lay of the land so minutely and particularly. it's creating the supports so that Palestinians, even in their situation of their dire situation, can still articulate a future. I think I think some of this is unprecedented to try to articulate a future while you're in a genocide, right? It's not stopped. And so I'm, it's new terrain, but it absolutely must be done. We know, like in my work, we always say change comes from the ground up. Change comes from the ground up. The best realities, the ones that will be durable, sustainable, have to come from the people. Anything imposed from the outside is not going to last. History shows that. And so, only to say that a lot of resources need to be poured into this, a lot of resources. And if you look at how much resources are being poured into undoing that kind of thing, we're up against it, right? And so donors have to get their head around that. We are watching Palestine and Palestinians disappear. We are watching it. Two-state solution. Two states. I mean, it's all disappearing. And unless we see more courageous, um, more courage and more courageous um, attribution of resources toward this, I fear.
Right. Skylar, do you want to follow up on anything that Leilani's just said about Gaza?
I want to agree with all of it, and then add in one thing that maybe is not necessarily the most politically correct thing for me to say, which is I agree that humanitarians do have, it's common practice to have community-led decision making, community groups identifying their needs. I mean, this is protection programming 101. What I've seen, not just in Gaza, talking about reconstruction, is there is a gap for humanitarians as we are emergency focused on where to either channel those community preferences to get them to the powerful reconstruction people. As Leilani was mentioning, Gaza is a particularly interesting case for that. Or who from the reconstruction world who has funding do we put directly in touch with the communities for them to be able to draw up their own urban plans and say where they want to live, etc. So it's this gap, which is why I say not politically correct necessarily, which is on us and on development actors and on funders of reconstruction activities. But that is a gap that we need to close in order for communities to have a better say in their futures. And then on the local authority side, this one is more difficult for me as a humanitarian because we often have very close relations with authorities. I mean, our job is to be neutral and impartial and to, as a legal actor, help people access legal systems that are in place, no matter the authority. But we are not working on the system strengthening. And if we want local authorities to have more say as well in the future of their areas, then this comes for me as part of that system strengthening. But as I said earlier in the question section, linked to practical evidence coming from humanitarian actors. I mean, that flow makes sense, but there needs to be system strengthening in line with them having a voice and not something being mandated to them.
Thanks. We've had a question come in. I don't know if the panelists, you can see the question. I'll read it out loud just in case you can't. So following on the current topic, I'm a firm believer in the right to restitution and compensation for HLP rights for affected populations. But how can you incorporate them in reconstruction processes efficiently, given that they usually require long and complex legal processes? Maybe communities want to articulate other ways of repairing harm and providing housing for everyone instead of using resources in lengthy, inexpensive legal processes. Does anyone want to tackle that question? Feel free to just jump in.
I could start, but I feel like others might have others. Me too, huge fan, restitution and compensation. From the various contexts where I work, it is a longer term, lengthy process. As you said, what we need to do is make sure people have documentation of those rights. And then when there is time and space for that, then we set up community councils and decide if there's another form other than financial or actually moving back to that particular piece of land. But their rights are documented in the moment so that they can later say, I had a right to this, I have lost access to, or it has been destroyed, etc., etc. And in this restitution process, now I want to figure out what is the best way to, compensate me for that. So I don't think it has to be necessarily in parallel with reconstruction, but the rights have to be documented before so that when systems are set up, people can show proof of any violations that have occurred. People can disagree.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, and you articulated it much better, Skylar. So I won't take another kick at the can, but I did want to say I think sometimes there's this sense that we have to wait to be invited to do certain things. And um, I mean, I'm not suggesting lawlessness, but in my experience, sometimes what has to happen is facts on the ground have to be created, and then the systems will follow. And so this is actually going back to the previous question in a way about community mobilizing, et cetera. And I mean, we all know that though we don't ask it of Palestinians, they are some of the most resilient people in the world, and they are very committed to their own future. And so I think if support could be given to Palestinians and just a wee bit of stability, I think it would be incredible what they could produce on their own about their own communities and what their needs are. And I think they could come together in real ways and start creating the facts on the ground themselves. Um, like I was thinking about local government and local authority and how that's kind of been demolished in Gaza, and how the authority is not trusted and labeled terrorist and etc. So obviously there's a vacuum there. And Skylar mentioned like the idea of community councils in a different context, but you know, people can create, we are our own beings. People can create whatever they want, in fact. And there was a community council system in Gaza, and so a local council system in Gaza, and so recreate it. But Palestinians won't be able to do that without support. They need support to yeah, seize their autonomy and not what's the waiting for? Waiting for what? The peace board? I mean, the peace board's not going to work in their interest. So what are there can not be any waiting is it and just I've been to many communities where they just create the facts on the ground. And in fact, Israel is expert at that themselves. The settlements, they created the facts on the ground. They're very difficult to dismantle the settlements. They've been created. There's a saying like every blade of grass and grain of sand has been accounted for by Israel, and they're acting on it. And so we really we need to empower Palestinians to do this, not a similar thing because they're just defending their indigeneity and their rights to restitution and to land and property, et cetera. So it's not really a parallel thing, but just empower them to, yeah, create facts on the ground.
Thanks, Leilani. Victoria, I'll give you the last word then.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree very much with Leilani, and I think we cannot wait till the peace is going to come. And that is the situation in Ukraine that we started reconstruction while it was a full-scale invasion, and it was a very right decision because we could do, frankly speaking, a lot. Now, of course, it is like there are also buildings which are completely damaged, and then for that there is completely different way to move forward. So there is a restitution ways, there are certificates, and you can use then these certificates to potentially then to buy the housing. And the problem is that the market prices are so high that people which lost their houses or their buildings are now under the occupation, they cannot receive these documents because we cannot and government cannot go there on the like in the war zone and from the drone make the photo of the house which is completely destroyed. So that is a problem which we are facing here, and that is a problem which people have, because maybe there are the processes for the restitution, but they cannot prove that their house, their home is completely destroyed because it is still on that site under the occupation. So that is the problem. So I think in such of the cases, it is good that there are some systems starting building, that the government starts building the systems, and of course it takes time. So now it is a like a 4 year of the full-scale war, and still we understand that that is going to develop and develop, unfortunately. But there are some steps in moving forward into finding the solution for such of the people, and there are a lot of them. But still, I will say that this work with the market of the affordable housing here in Ukraine is most important, because of the situation at all in the world, the prices are not lowering; they are even increasing. So people cannot afford to buy anything, so we need to find other solutions for them. And for example, affordable housing might be the good solution, social housing might be the good solution, but still we are only starting making the first steps, adopting of the laws, of the regulations, going through reforms to someday come to it and be able to provide people with a decent housing.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And huge thanks to our panel for such a rich and engaging discussion. So we're going to wrap up now with two donor representatives who are going to give closing remarks. So first we have Didier Sagashaya, who's a senior land administration specialist for the World Bank. And he'll be followed by Pavel Krasny, a principal human capital development specialist for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So Didier, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and very much appreciated the good panel discussion. Before I give my closing remarks, let me really bit comment on what has been discussed. One, on the bridging the gap between the transition between humanitarian and the development. I think we have a lot to do, all of us participating on this panel, to bridge that gap, to make sure that there is a better coordination. That's my first comment. The second one, Jim and Skyra, you mentioned about the registration, the recording of property rights and land rights. I think donors, development partners, we need to start making a lot of investment into recording rights before anything happens, before any disaster happens, before any conflict happens. I'm leading a project in the West Bank for registering property in area A and B for the World Bank. I think this will create people having documentation if anything happens. So those are the two things I wanted to comment on. But now I want to leave the audience with three things. One, yes, the bank supports always the reconstruction. That's the reason it was created in the first instance. And we need to, as a bank, as donors, to be involved in the post-conflict policy development to make sure that the transition between short-term, long-term, medium-term is very, very well coordinated. But also donors and the bank itself, we need to continue of Gaza, which has been mentioned a lot in this discussion. There is a lot which is needed. 15 billions of losses that were identified in RDNA and so on and so forth. So there is we need to have rights to blended financing, because not any single donor will come and cover all the losses that are there. How can we have private sector bringing in the possibility like it is done in Ukraine, for example? And the last point I want to make is about adopting a people-centered approach. And I'll a little bit elaborate on this one, because we are talking about inclusive housing implementation models with involving public, civil society, communities collaboration. We've talked about right-based approach to housing, particularly focusing on vulnerable people. We talked about strategies of equitability. We need to see the subsidies versus the compensation model, the owner versus the contractor-driven housing. But personally, I think we need also to reduce time we are spending on politics and be able to provide housing to the people who are suffering. Because I find sometimes different organization, different. This is a personal opinion. We spend a lot of time politics here and there, and we forget that there are people who are suffering. And by the time we go back to them, then it's maybe too late. So that's what the three things I want to mention here. Maybe coming back on Gaza, as you all know, the World Bank and EU and the UN worked on in the interim rapid damage and needs assessment, which was published last year, and we are finalizing the we'll call it the last one. We hope the last one probably will come out in coming few weeks. But from those needs that will be identified, has been identified, the bank is preparing to work with different partners to see how to support the recovery, to support the reconstruction, using the vast knowledge and expertise in the reconstruction we have accumulated all over the years. So it's, as you all know, development is a bridge between conflict and stability. So the scale of the reconstruction in the world, especially we are talking about today, Ukraine, we are talking about Gaza, is huge. So that's why we need a lot of coordination and beyond talking about coordination. So what are we doing to bridge that gap that we continue to talk about humanitarian and development area? So that's where I want to stop by. I just want to again recognize that team. So the Jim mentioned a little bit about Africa because there is, which in this panel we focused more on Ukraine, Gaza, but there is also some conflicts and disaster happening in Africa. He mentioned about Mozambique. There are a lot of disasters happening there. So we also need to see how that is included into what we're discussing in all our clusters. So I'll stop here. And again, Kerry, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists.
Great. Thank you, Didier. So, Pavel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kerry, and welcome everyone, and thank you for this very fruitful discussion. So I represent the EBRD, which is an international financial institution financing public and private projects in the housing sector, among others. And I second the thing that, we're project driven, we're very bottom up. People come to us with ideas, with projects. We try to find the finance. We try to find additional kind of forms of support, which is sometimes one step removed from big discussions. But that doesn't mean that those discussions are not there. And once we have projects, we go to see counterparts such as yourselves, and we have a partnership with Habitat to make sure we do things right. So we are not per se a rights-based institution. We are an institution that fosters social progress, economic empowerment, equality of opportunity for people displaced by war and disasters. But of course, this is very linked, and we tried as good as we can to enforce the rights related to housing. In this HDP nexus, our role is a bit more kind of creating that ramp from the humanitarian response into a place where local public and private players can deliver, follow on, expand, and do more in the phase on the recovery, including by not losing track of the most vulnerable group. So maybe two small examples of the type of thing we do. We do housing in Ukraine. We do housing with organizations that provide transitional housing, that provide affordable housing, and that create paths for people who have been displaced, meaning from a free transitional housing to an affordable section where you don't have to pay a lot, to an affordable that they pay more, to a rent-to-own model where they try paying into their own ownership. So I think there's this pathway that's not just a transfer, as we said, discussed today between humanitarian and recovery. For individuals, there are pathways that we can create in the kind of system going in that direction. We also work on providing support for people in those housing, and we receive housing as a vehicle to outreach, to extend our help to those people. We also work on the infrastructure finance, and this connects to what we have been speaking today of, housing that is a bit of a holistic, it's a big topic, it's not just specific brick and mortar. So whether it's in Turkey, where we finance infrastructure for cities where all the refugees or the displaced people from the earthquake came, or in Jordan, where we help municipalities cope with the additional need for utilities, water, electricity linked to the Syrian refugee crisis. This is also something you try to put in the general context. Now, infrastructure financing has to come very early, as soon as possible, as soon as those needs are identified, but it's a long-term investment that supports the recovery. Now, I just want to touch on one topic that came back on private sector players, and because it's a bit of a mandate, and I always thought it quite good to get back to that question of predatory real estate or disaster capitalism, and it is a risk. At the same time, we are also in the realm where reconstruction needs to have some form of dynamic with kind of private sector players. So how do we manage that? I think it's not an easy solution. There's not one size fits all. There's not an easy response. But I would say as an international financial institution, we try to find the right players. We have found in those crisis contexts, whether it's in Ukraine, in Jordan, in Turkey, in a European country that took in Ukrainian refugees, we have found keen players who are willing to create shelters in their unused kind of offices, for instance. Or create a humanitarian logistics center on the parking lot of a destroyed mall in Turkey. So those are the people we try to work with as EBRD. Second point, and we've touched this upon, it's about due diligence. It's about the research. It's about making sure that when we act, we do not harm, and that we don't just do not harm to the people we host through our kind of housing projects, is that we implement the best practice of what we do. Lastly, I think there's a lot to be done on providing services through our investment, meaning that we want to empower local community to fight this kind of predatory logic, but we also want people to have the agency to prevent what we would call negative externalities, which is all the situation when everyone means well, but if we're not careful, things are not done in the right way. This is the type of work we're doing with Habitat, where, for instance, we have a big developer hosting IDPs, and we want to ensure that those members of the development have the adequate support. They can reach out for help from NGOs, they can reach out for help from the public sector, they can get reparations, and they are not left on their own, but they can also self-organize. And that's also something we are feeling very strongly on. So just to wrap up, I think just on the general themes, and I really was happy to discuss and hear about all of these, housing as a holistic good, and this kind of holistic aspect of communities, of built on wider environment, on neighboring community, I think is key. Housing as a vehicle, people are placed under our or someone else's, but someone from the next responsibility, and this is an entry point for individual level, because at the end it's about the people and not the buildings. And C, agency. The more we can say what we think should be best or have ideas of what should be best, but ideally, ultimately, local empowerment will lead to those outcomes we're looking after. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Pavel. And thanks to everyone who's attended today's session. So I hope you've all found today's discussion as rich and as thought-provoking as I did. The recording of today's session will appear on the ODI Global website over the next few days. So if you have colleagues that you think might benefit from the insights that were shared today, please do share that link with them, which I think one of my comms colleagues is going to put in the chat. So thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Kerry.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Sharing.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.